As I stood there, my breath forming little puffs in the cold air, Christopher turned his back to me. "Don't talk to me, I'm tired," he muttered, his eyes devoid of warmth. As he brushed past, his shoulder bumped into mine, a small yet sharp reminder of the distance growing between us. I opened my mouth to speak, to call after him, but the words dissolved into the chilly atmosphere. His indifferent stride carried him towards the changing room, leaving me rooted to the spot, helplessly watching his retreating figure. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I found myself kneeling on the ground, my hands trembling slightly. "I can't believe this," I whispered to no one, staring blankly at the pavement. Christopher hadn't even altered his expression, not a flicker of regret or hesitation. It felt as though I were invisible to him now. For months, maybe even years, I had endured this growing coldness, telling myself stories to justify his behavior. Maybe Christopher is just overwhelmed with work, I mused, trying to shake off the hurt. I clung to the belief that if I could just find the right way to be, the right things to say, Christopher would revert to the man I fell in love with. I had bent over backwards, reshaped my very being, hoping for a sign of change in him. Yet, nothing seemed to affect him, he remained aloof and distant. In my heart, I knew what I had to do, though the thought terrified me. I had come to the grim resolution that I needed to end this marriage, to free myself from this painful limbo. "It's over," I resolved, a silent vow to reclaim my life. As I rose to my feet, a glint of light from Christopher's mobile phone caught my eye. It lay on the table, innocently displaying a new message. My heart skipped a beat as I read the preview, an unfamiliar name flashing across the screen. Without thinking, I picked up the phone, my hands shaking. The message opened, and the words hit me like a cold wave. It was clear now, I couldn't turn back. "My name is Zoe, and I am 26 years old. Not long ago, I married Christopher, the man I thought was the love of my life," I said to myself, trying to gather the fragments of my fractured thoughts. We had moved into our new home, leaving behind my family, who had showered me with love and concern on my wedding day. "Be happy, Zoe," they had said, their voices thick with unshed tears. Christopher, despite his past, a brief, failed marriage that had ended due to personality differences, had seemed the epitome of reassurance and charm. My father, wary of his history, had made Christopher promise to take good care of me. In response, Christopher had confidently pulled out a pre-filled divorce form and handed it to my father. "If I can't make Zoe happy, please submit this," he had declared, an odd mixture of seriousness and something indefinable in his tone. Now, as I stood alone, holding his phone, that same form seemed not just a precaution but a prophetic gesture. Christopher had prepared for this moment, perhaps knowing before I did that our happiness was not to be. The reality of our situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront this, to face the future, whatever it might hold. "I apologize for causing worry to all of you because of my divorce history, so this is like an insurance. I won't need to use this, I'm determined to make her happy, please accept it," Christopher had said, his voice earnest as he handed over the pre-filled divorce form to my father. Dad was visibly perplexed by the gesture, but he took Christopher's sincerity to heart. He silently nodded and accepted the form. That was the second reason for Dad's concern. Christopher was quite the charmer, and an eccentric man. "I'll trust you," Dad had said, his expression a complex mix of hope and skepticism. Our married life began under these peculiar and promising circumstances. It wasn't exactly the fairy tale I had envisioned, but I was full of hope, looking forward to what our shared future might bring. However, the reality that awaited me, full of such anticipation, turned out to be unexpectedly harsh. After quitting my job to become a full-time housewife, I embraced the role with a kind of fervor. Each morning, I woke up earlier than Christopher, prepared everything for his day, and saw him off with a bright smile. "Have a good day, do your best," I would chirp, just as I had before we were married. Back then, Christopher would envelop me in a hug, plant a kiss on my forehead, and cheerfully declare, "I'm off. I'll do my best for you," as he left the house, his hand waving goodbye. But after marriage, everything changed. Now, it was just a curt yeah, and with that single, indifferent word, Christopher would leave the house. His aloofness was so jarring that at first, I wondered if he was unwell. Moreover, when he returned home, his strangeness only deepened. "Welcome home. Would you like dinner, or would you like to take a bath?" I would greet him with our usual routine. To this, Christopher would languidly reply, "Bath. Just bath." Confused by his abruptness, I couldn't help but ask, "Is something wrong?" But he would just glance at me coldly and mutter, "Nothing." Reflecting on those days, perhaps getting any response from him was better than the silence that soon followed. A week into our marriage, Christopher stopped responding altogether. On his good days, he might acknowledge me with a word or a gesture, but the real problem emerged when he was in a bad mood. On those days, he completely ignored me. "Hey, don't ignore me. You've been like this ever since we got married. Did I do something wrong?" I would plead, desperate for some form of acknowledgement. Christopher would remain silent, and upon seeing my mounting distress and the tears starting to form, he sighed heavily and said, "You think crying solves everything, don't you? Must be nice being a woman, it's so easy." I wanted to deny his harsh words, but the tears came unbidden. All I could do was look down and silently hide my tears. It was then that I recalled my earlier life, a stark contrast to my current isolation. My father runs a successful company, and I am, as one might say, a president's daughter. Before marrying Christopher, I worked as an office clerk at my dad's company. It was there, in the professional yet warm environment of my father's office, that I first met Christopher. As an office clerk, I frequently handled the sales slips for various employees, including Christopher, who worked in sales. Over time, our professional interactions blossomed into a more personal connection, and eventually, he asked me out. He was genuinely surprised when he learned that I was the president's daughter, which pleased me immensely. It meant he saw me for who I was, not just for my family connections. Back then, the Christopher I knew would listen intently to my stories and respond with warmth and a sincere smile. Sadly, that version of Christopher seems to have vanished. Now, as I look back, I find myself regretting my decision to marry him. I've racked my brain trying to pinpoint a reason for his drastic change, wondering if perhaps I did something wrong. But the only explanation that makes sense is the marriage itself. It's often said that marriage brings about change, sometimes due to a newfound sense of relaxation or familiarity. In Christopher's case, however, the change was alarmingly profound. Had I foreseen this transformation, I would never have agreed to marry him. Today, I pulled out a sheet of paper from a file that I'd kept hidden away in my desk. It was the divorce application form that Christopher had presented to my father as a bizarre form of prenuptial assurance. As I held it now, I wondered, if I submitted this form to City Hall, could I somehow bring back the old Christopher? I spent several days contemplating, looking at the form and then placing it back in its drawer, unresolved. Then, one unusual weekday, I came back from shopping to find Christopher standing in the doorway with an unsettlingly grim expression. It struck me as odd. Why was he home in the middle of a weekday? Trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, I greeted him with a tentative smile. But without a word, he slammed his hand down on the table. Startled by the sudden noise, I stumbled and fell. Christopher stepped closer, his gaze icy as he looked down at me. In his hand was the divorce application form, now ominously filled out. My heart sank as I realized I might have left it out after looking at it earlier that day. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice cold and hard. Fearfully, I nodded. "Do you want to divorce me?" he continued, his eyes boring into mine. I hesitated, caught off guard by the confrontation. Living with Christopher had become a mental and emotional ordeal, and yes, I had been considering divorce as a painful but necessary option. "It's because you've been strange since we got married," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "You ignore everything I say, and this isn't happiness." "So, it's my fault then," he retorted, glaring at the divorce form. "I'm fine with divorcing," he declared abruptly. "But remember, in this case, Zoe, you're the one at fault." The problem lies with you failing to support your husband as a wife should. Christopher waved the divorce application form menacingly. But his words stung deeply, contradicting the promise he had made to my father, to make me happy. That promise now seemed like nothing more than empty words, leaving me to grapple with the shattered pieces of our life together. Before I could finish expressing my despair, Christopher interrupted with a cynical snort. Promise to make you happy, huh? That's a typical princess way of thinking. How naive you and your family must be. His words stung with an acidity that made me recoil. Clearly, our worlds are too different. It might be good for you to experience poverty for once. I was dumbfounded by his cruelty, not understanding what he truly meant by those words. But from that day, the harsh reality of his statement came crashing down on me. Christopher stopped providing any living expenses. To my horror, he even took away my credit and debit cards. Originally, I had quit my job at his request. I want you to greet me cheerfully when I come home, he had said, painting a picture of domestic bliss that now seemed nothing more than a manipulative fantasy. Fulfilling his wish, I became a housewife, unknowingly setting the stage for my own financial dependency. As a housewife with no income, I found myself. Christopher took care of the rent and utilities, but he left everything else to me, including managing our food supplies, which were now dangerously low. Please, I need living expenses, I begged him one day, the humiliation burning in my cheeks. His response was chilling. Don't worry, I'll eat out, he said nonchalantly, brushing off my pleas. No matter how much I implored, he remained unmoved, leaving me without any means to buy food. Night after night, Christopher came home late, if at all, while I scraped by on what little food remained and the occasional instant meal. My situation grew increasingly desperate. On a rare evening when he returned home earlier, I mustered all my courage to confront the direness of our situation. You don't give me any money, and you don't talk to me. This isn't happiness, this isn't even a marriage. If this life continues, if you don't intend to change, please, let's get a divorce, I declared, my voice quivering with a mixture of fear and resolve. I had hoped that this confrontation might spark some semblance of remorse or at least a willingness to reconsider our situation. If Christopher showed even a hint of willingness to change, it would give me a reason to hold on. But instead, what I got was a cold dismissal. Don't talk to me, I'm tired, he repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. With that, he coldly averted his eyes, pushed past my shoulder as I stood in front of him, and walked away toward the changing room. Wait. I tried to call out, but my voice failed me. As his indifferent back disappeared, my knees buckled, and I knelt down, overwhelmed by a dizzying mix of disbelief and despair. He hadn't changed a single expression on his face. As I knelt there, the painful realization hit me. Christopher had completely changed after marriage, and I agonized over whether it was partly my fault. Perhaps it was because he was busy with work, I reasoned, desperately searching for an explanation in the sea of confusion and hurt. But deep down, I knew these excuses couldn't justify his coldness. They couldn't mend the growing rift between us. I tried to convince myself, searching for any reason to justify Christopher's behavior. I held on to the hope that if I changed in some way, perhaps Christopher would revert to the man I once loved. Despite my best efforts, he remained distant and unchanged. It was then I realized I had no choice but to take the final step. I resolved that this would truly be the end. Normally, wouldn't someone show a hint of panic or distress if their spouse they supposedly loved asked for a divorce? Yet, Christopher's face displayed no disturbance, he seemed more annoyed than anything. It was a clear indication that he no longer harbored any love for me. Let's get a divorce once and for all. There's no point in continuing this, I thought bitterly, my stomach growling with hunger as a painful reminder of my neglected needs. As I slowly stood up, determined to end this farce of a marriage, I headed towards the drawer to retrieve the divorce application form. Just then, I noticed the screen of Christopher's mobile phone light up on the table. It looked like a new message had arrived. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the screen, only to be taken aback by what I saw, a screen full of heart emojis. I impulsively picked up the phone to check the message, which read, "Thank you for yesterday, let's spend another night together soon." The sender was someone named Lily. I racked my brain but had no recollection of anyone with that name. As I checked towards the changing room, there was still no sign of Christopher coming out. Turning back to the phone, which was carelessly left unlocked, I sighed. The more I scrolled, the clearer the evidence of infidelity became. The intimate message exchanges with Lily were damning enough, but there were also pictures of them snuggled up close together. Such careless disregard for secrecy, leaving conclusive evidence without even locking the phone, was astounding. Did he think it was okay for me to find out? Or was he underestimating me? At that moment, any remaining sorrow turned into a cold, calm resolve. I used my phone to record the evidence displayed on Christopher's mobile, ensuring I captured everything that might be relevant. After finishing, I placed the mobile phone back on the table exactly as I had found it. Christopher emerged from the bath, his demeanor unchanged, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. He retreated to his room without a word, continuing as if nothing had happened. It was simple, Christopher was cheating. That explained his distant behavior and lack of interest in our marriage. My sorrow transformed into action. From the next day, I began taking steps towards divorcing Christopher. There was no more hesitation or confusion, just a sharp clarity and anger at being so blatantly betrayed. First, I needed to find out exactly who Lily was. Hiring a professional would ensure a thorough investigation, so I decided to hire a detective. At the same time, I prepared myself mentally and legally for the divorce proceedings. My determination was set. It was time to close this painful chapter and move on from a man who saw me as nothing more than an afterthought. Continuing my personal investigation into Christopher's suspicious late work hours and frequent weekend work, I was determined to get to the bottom of things. His pattern of behavior was all too indicative of someone leading a double life. The pain of involving my father in this was significant, but I had no other choice. I needed his resources and insights. I was prepared to show Christopher exactly what it felt like to be betrayed. The hardest part of the whole ordeal was still having to see Christopher every day during the divorce preparations. The face that I once adored now only stirred up a visceral desire to lash out at him. Perhaps my disdain was more evident than I intended, because one day, Christopher remarked snidely, "You're looking uglier than usual. Are you sick or something?" His attempt at initiating conversation was as tactless as ever. I masked my feelings and replied with a calm smile, "I'm fine." I knew that once everything was in order, I wouldn't have to tolerate his presence much longer. Taking action over the weekend, while Christopher was at work, I made my move. I confided everything to my father, who was understandably furious, but acted swiftly to support me. Initially, I thought about returning to my parents' house, but with my sister having just returned there for her childbirth, it seemed too chaotic and stressful an environment given my circumstances. Thankfully, Dad had another option. He arranged for me to move into a mansion worth $1 million, a property owned by a relative who was not in a rush to sell. This relative kindly allowed me to stay there. Dad also provided me with enough money to cover my immediate needs, ensuring that my transition was as smooth and comfortable as possible. 3 days after my departure, I received a call from a bewildered Christopher. "Where the hell are you now?" he demanded. Playing it cool, I simply replied, "Who knows?" His voice tensed further as he brought up the divorce papers. "The divorce papers are missing." "Don't tell me you." It surprised me how quickly he noticed their absence. Perhaps he started searching frantically as soon as he realized I was gone. It was the first time I had seen, or rather heard, Christopher so utterly flustered. Even through the phone, I could almost see his panicked expression, and I couldn't help but laugh a little. "What about it?" I said, maintaining my calm demeanor. "I've submitted them to the office," I informed him straightforwardly. Christopher made a strange, choked noise. "What? Why?" he stammered. "You said remember, if you can't make me happy, I should submit them," I reminded him, my voice steady. "You even declared it with a smug face." That was just to reassure Zoe's parents, he spluttered, clearly panicking now because I had actually followed through on his hollow promise. And I told you before, if this kind of life continues, I want a divorce. That time I was just tired, I said, finally letting go of the burden he had become. The clarity and decisiveness in my voice marked the closure I had been seeking, turning his insincere gesture into a definitive end to our marriage. As Christopher's explanations dwindled into silence over the phone, I couldn't help but cut him off sharply, my voice a mixture of disappointment and resolve. I talked to Dad, and he said your department isn't that busy, I said, dismantling his perpetual excuse of being overwhelmed with work. He always claimed to be swamped, justifying his late returns home and constant weekend work. I had never doubted him before, merely worried. But now, reflecting on it, I realized I should have been more skeptical. Was Christopher really going to work, or should I have investigated? I found myself questioning his integrity more deeply than ever. You know, I asked Dad when I saw him yesterday, and even he was puzzled, I continued, pressing him for the truth. Overtime is one thing, but weekend work should only happen a few times a year. So, you weren't really working, were you? What were you so busy with every week? Where were you going? Christopher's silence on the other end of the line was telling. He couldn't respond, and I knew it. He was probably scrambling for an excuse, but this time, no amount of smooth talking could save him. Lily, right? She's quite the cutie, I teased, though my heart felt heavy with betrayal. I could practically hear him gasp over the phone. How did you? Detectives are quite efficient, I explained, holding the photos and report in my hand, reading aloud from them. Lily, a 22-year-old office worker in the accounting department, more than a decade younger than you. I'm 8 years younger too. Christopher seems to like younger women, HM? Lives in an apartment near the downtown area, 2nd floor. Wow, so you've been visiting her every week. Zoe, wait, Lily is, Christopher began, his voice frantic and needy. I interrupted, you used to cling to me a lot before we got married. Seeing you, 8 years older, acting so needy made me happy back then. But now, the thought disgusts me. I continued, the information from the detective's firm in my grasp. By the way, conversations with Lily are also safely recorded as evidence. Wait until I divorce my wife. What a classic line from a married man. Couldn't you come up with something better? The detective had also suggested that Christopher looked down on me quite a bit. Your wife will find out, you know. It doesn't matter, she's on her way down anyway. That's what he said. I was utterly underestimated. Zoe, you're misunderstanding something, can we meet just once? Christopher's voice was desperate, pleading. I suppose we should meet one last time, I agreed, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. The next night, we arranged to meet with Lily accompanying him, at the mansion I was renting. When Christopher arrived at the designated time, he seemed uneasy, his eyes wide as he took in the opulence of the mansion. What's with this mansion? He stammered, his voice cracking. It's a place I'm renting. It's worth $1 million, I replied coolly. $1 million? Christopher repeated, his voice breaking slightly as he glanced around. Dad watched him intently, from across the room. So, your dad is here too? Christopher asked, his eyes darting nervously. Well, yes, it's only fair since you brought Lily. Plus, this affair involves company employees. It's best if Dad is here as he's the company's head, I explained, standing my ground as I prepared to confront the entire situation head-on. As the confrontation unfolded in the luxurious setting of the mansion, Christopher managed a forced smile and said, I suppose you're right, even as my father's eyes burned into him with undisguised disdain. Lily, with her bright hair and petite frame, might have looked innocuous, but her demeanor was anything but. The moment the discussion started, she immediately positioned herself as another victim. I'm a victim too, she declared, her voice firm. I had no idea Christopher was married, and now I'm dragged here. It's unpleasant. Her assertiveness caught me off guard, but it was Christopher's reaction that truly shocked me. He turned to her, his face coloring with rage. "What? You were the one pushing me to leave my wife," he exclaimed. Lily's reply was swift and dismissive, "That was just a joke." They began to argue fiercely in front of us, with Lily scoffing, "To think I'd be serious about an old man like you." Christopher retorted, his anger peaking, "Excuse me? Who do you think caused all this? You said our company was doomed. That's why I decided to end it with Zoe." The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. Apparently, right after we had gotten married, Lily had whispered poison into Christopher's ear, suggesting that the company was on the brink of bankruptcy and that as a husband, he would suffer too. At first, Christopher hadn't taken her seriously, but over time, Lily's manipulative words took root. Seeing me act considerately, he jumped to the conclusion that the company must indeed be in dire straits. "I thought you were sweet-talking me to saddle me with debts," he admitted in confusion. I found it bizarre that everyone had been overly kind to me, initially attributing it to the cautious behavior of those around the president's daughter. But the idea that my father's company was in crisis was a complete misunderstanding. My father, having overheard this, interjected firmly, "Thanks to everyone, we're actually thriving. There's absolutely no chance of going under anytime soon." At his words, Christopher collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the reality of his misjudgments. What was all this for, ultimately? I pondered aloud. It became clear that Lily had been intrigued by Christopher, who had married the president's daughter, and approached him out of mere curiosity. Initially ignored, she fabricated a lie to catch his attention, claiming, "The company is finished. Being married to the president's daughter puts you at risk too." This lie had evidently worked on Christopher, leading him to distance himself from me, possibly in hopes of an amicable divorce to escape a non-existent downfall. I was just deceived, Zoe. You understand, right? Christopher approached me, his expression strained, seeking sympathy or perhaps forgiveness. "Well, perhaps you were merely deceived," I acknowledged, my voice cold. "But let's not talk about divorce just yet. You know, this has made things very clear to me." Christopher looked up, puzzled by my response. I continued, "Essentially, you would be the first to flee if we were ever in the same predicament. This time, you even cheated without consulting me about how business was going. Moreover, instead of proposing divorce directly, you manipulated things so that it would seem like the suggestion came from me. Which is the height of cowardice. You know, the vows, in sickness and in health? You would probably abandon me without hesitation if I fell ill." "No, I wouldn't do that, Zoe." "Please listen," Christopher started, but I cut him off. "There's nothing left to discuss." The finality in my voice marked the end of our conversation, leaving no room for further excuses or lies. The realization of his duplicity and the impact of his actions left me resolute in moving forward, with or without him. During the final, tumultuous meeting with Christopher and Lily, I had one clear goal: to understand why I had been so negligently ignored. "I just wanted to know why you were ignoring me all this time. I thought I had done something wrong." "Let's handle the rest through our lawyers," I stated firmly, watching as Christopher's face drained of color. His affair, now exposed, held severe consequences. Having an affair while married, did you think there wouldn't be any consequences? I'll make sure both you, Lily, and you, Christopher, are properly charged for the divorce proceedings. Christopher's voice trembled, laced with desperation. "Wait, if I can't even stay at the company, how can I afford the surety for a divorce trial?" Almost simultaneously, Lily also protested, her voice panicked. "No way, that's ridiculous. It was all just a joke and it's his fault for falling for it." They turned on each other, each insisting they were not at fault. Watching them argue so childishly was revolting. It made me sick to think I had endured a month of agony for these two. To the bickering pair, I said with a cold smile, "Now I understand, you two are perfect for each other, so alike." I made the right decision stepping back. Well, we won't be seeing each other again. Goodbye. As Dad and I turned to leave, Christopher's desperate calls followed us. He kept shouting my name, but I ignored him completely. Later, the surety for the divorce proceedings arrived from both Christopher and Lily. Christopher, having a decent amount of savings, paid his share in one lump sum. Lily's payment also came in a lump sum, funded by her parents. At the company, the fallout from their actions was inevitable. I tried to calm Dad, who was furious and pondering whether to fire Christopher immediately. Eventually, both Christopher and Lily couldn't stand the scrutiny and resigned on their own. Dad was relieved, perhaps more than anyone else, and there was a palpable sense of relief that Christopher, who seemed to have been crying over his lost privileges and status as the president's son-in-law, was out of our lives for good. The thought of never having to see his face again was indeed refreshing. Upon returning home as a divorcee, my family welcomed me warmly. I also returned to my previous job as an office clerk. I had worried I might be treated delicately, but to my surprise, everyone welcomed me back warmly. "Since it's over, I was always wondering why someone like you chose him," someone commented, giving me a supportive pat on the back, which made me burst into laughter. "If I ever get married again, I'll make sure to avoid someone who's only good on the outside," I vowed, smiling at the new beginning that awaited me, free from deceit and